Video 2 will pick up by looking at different types of love during adolescence and emerging adulthood. If you're unfamiliar with Sternberg's triarchic theory of love, he believed that love has 3 different components: passion, intimacy, and commitment. Commitment, of course, is dedicating yourself to another person, while intimacy might best be described as emotional closeness. Passion, on the other hand, consists of things like sexual attraction or a strong desire to be with and be near another person. And as you can see here, these 3 variables combine in multiple ways to produce certain types of relationships. We know that during adolescence, commitment, or dedicating yourself to staying with another person and making a relationship work, of course, tends to be pretty low. Teenagers don't necessarily commit to one another for long periods of time. As we move through later adolescence and into emerging adulthood, we see an increase in commitment. Adolescent relationships specifically tend to involve a high degree of infatuation. Infatuation is what we call it when there is just passion, sexual attraction, or a strong desire to be near another person, but we tend to not necessarily see high degrees of intimacy or commitment. Later on during adolescence, we do start to see an increase in intimacy, where we move into something called romantic love. Still low levels of commitment, but we start to become emotionally close to other people. And then as we move into emerging adulthood, we see that increase in commitment in the other categories of love, like companionate love, which you can think of as friendship, so romantic relationships, but without passion almost. Fatuous love, where we see passion and a high degree of commitment with low emotional investment. And then consummate love, which combines all of these. How then do we see relationships beginning to form during adolescence? Once again, we start by seeing high degrees of passion. But who do we feel passionately towards? You might be under the impression that for the average person, opposites attract. We tend to feel passionately towards people who are very different from us. That is in fact not the case for the average person. You might have heard the expression before, birds of a feather flock together, and that does tend to be true. Just like we discussed friends befriending people who are similar to them, we tend to become romantically attracted to people who share certain characteristics with us. Characteristics can be things like the same ethnicity. We want someone who understands our ethnic experience. Same educational aspirations, same religious beliefs, same hobbies, and so on and so forth. The theory here is something called consensual validation, where we like people who share our characteristics and view of life because we find that validating. We also tend to see consensual validation, or being attracted to similar people, producing less conflict within a relationship. That being said, we do know that many healthy relationships involve some degree of differences as well, where you're attracted to someone who shares the important similarities, but you're different in the ways that you kind of need the other one to have your back or to compensate for your shortcomings. So we do desire some degree of differences in relationships, but overall, we are attracted to people similar to us. So let's take a second and look at how the formation of new relationships changes throughout adolescence. This model of different stages of romantic relationships during adolescence is called Brown's model of relationship development. During early adolescence, we start in something called the initiation phase, where we're kind of just dipping our toes into the water. We're starting to be attracted to specific individuals and might be taking very tentative, short, brief steps towards pursuing that interest. You might hold someone's hand for the first time or call them on the phone. I'm obviously very old. I'm sure people don't call each other anymore, but you start to see very brief and anxious interactions, kissing someone for the first time, maybe spending a few minutes alone while you're hanging out with a bigger group of friends, but we don't see a lot of commitment or long-term interaction. As we get a little bit older, we move into something called the status phase, where because we've had those initial brief, anxious interactions, we're now more confident in our abilities and start to choose specific partners for specific reasons. During the status phase, however, as you might imagine, we tend to choose our partners based off of social status. Whose social status matches mine? Whose social status might gain me a bit of popularity? So we don't necessarily see much emotional investment yet or any intimacy. A little bit later on, we do start to involve intimacy and attraction and affection into our decision-making process. We call this the affection phase, where we begin to choose partners not based off of their status, but based off of how we feel about them. During the affection phase, we do tend to see the first increase in sexual activity. And then by the end of adolescence, we move into something called the bonding phase, where we have all of those earlier components, affection, sexual attraction, maybe even still some status-based decision-making, but we start to commit. This is when we see an increase in commitment and the formation of long-term, affection-based relationships. What then happens when a relationship ends? I want to take a few minutes and look at breaking up during adolescence and emerging adulthood. We know that during adolescence, we see an increase in negative emotions following a breakup. And because of adolescent egocentrism, those negative emotions tend to be very strong, where the teenager has the belief that no one's ever gone through what they're going through before. And it might even seem extremely dramatic to an adult. But it's important to remember here that because of the cognitive biases of adolescence, they truly feel like they're going through something unique, and it can be a very emotionally intense experience. This is something that happens to most adolescents. Most teenagers experience a breakup from time to time. That being said, we don't know much more about breaking up during adolescence. There's not a ton of research that looks at it. During emerging adulthood, however, we do see more research investigating the causes and impact of breakups. Emotionally speaking, emerging adults tend to experience temporary moderate depression after a breakup because we've seen an increase in those components of mutual affection and commitment. In terms of why people break up during emerging adulthood, we see a lot of common themes. Lack of common interest, conflicting sexual attitudes, one person moving faster than the other, communication problems, of course, pop up, greater desire for independence, being able to be your own person tends to be a common reason, as does boredom, just being tired of a relationship. The last variable that tends to prompt breakups during emerging adulthood is the presence of alternative others. An alternative other is someone else in your social world who you might have the opportunity to begin dating. That's especially important during emerging adulthood, where we see people wanting to maintain that independence and wanting to maintain the ability to date other individuals. An interesting thing we've learned from looking at reasons for breaking up during emerging adulthood is that the two individuals involved in the couple very rarely give the same reason. So, if asked right after a relationship is dissolved why you broke up, each partner is likely to give a different reason. Meaning that most likely there was multiple variables that contributed to the breakup, and each variable was felt more intensely by a specific partner. We also know that during emerging adulthood, women are more likely than men to end the relationship. And in fact, men during this period of life tend to take rejection harder than women do. An experience that women have, much more commonly than men, however, is something called romantic harassment. Romantic harassment happens when an individual who is either interested in someone romantically or recently ended a relationship with someone uses either psychological or physical abuse in attempts to maintain that relationship, to stay with someone or get back together. Romantic harassment involves things like calling someone repeatedly or texting them repeatedly late at night, early in the morning, stalking them, watching or following them in public, insulting them, sometimes physically attacking, or using threats to try to maintain that relationship. An interesting component that we've, of course, seen an increase in recently is the use of social media to romantically harass individuals. Hostile comments or posts, where you're basically just trying to manipulate that person to reach out to you, to contact you, so that you can reform the relationship. We know that about 50% of college women report being romantically harassed at some point during their college experience. So this is extremely common and extremely troubling. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, this is a very common occurrence, and it's not always taken seriously because, thinking back to our first lecture, the dating scripts that are used, we expect men to be proactive, and sometimes culture can view these romantic harassment behaviors as just the man being proactive. And that's not okay, because none of these behaviors are appropriate, especially when the partner has indicated that they no longer want to be involved in the relationship. So romantic harassment is something we all need to be aware of. We need to know that it is not okay, it is never okay, and that it is a real problem for many women. What I want to end video 2 by looking at is the reasons we choose a marriage partner. So we've talked about why we choose to start dating someone and how those choices or variables change as we move through adolescence and emerging adulthood. Towards the end of emerging adulthood, choices tend to shift away from who do I want to date and towards who do I want to marry. The couple of things that I want to point out here, you'll notice that even though we have reasons broken down by gender, the top 3 reasons are the same. Most emerging adults pick marriage partners based off of mutual attraction, love being the most important variable, having a dependable character, and being emotionally stable and mature. Those are the 3 most important aspects of choosing a partner. And from there, you'll notice some degree of variation in the traits that we're looking for by gender. However, they're all present, right? Good looks matter, being sociable matters, desiring a home and children, or at least being compatible in that regard matters. The next thing I want to point out is the lowest trait. The one that is least often reported is chastity and political background. While these are still important, they're not as important as some individuals might think when it comes to choosing a marriage partner, specifically political background. We tend to rate religious expectations, religious backgrounds, as more desirable or more important than political backgrounds. So, even though we know that birds of a feather flock together, and we're not necessarily attracted to people who are different than us, the specific trait that we want to share might matter less than other desirable similarities. That brings me to the end of video 2. Video 3 will pick up looking at sexuality.